So, do you know what a siege is? The word comes from the Latin meaning to sit. A siege is a military blockade that sits around a city that cannot be easily conquered or refuses to surrender. Sieges block water and food and fuel and medicines from getting into a city. They're often decided by starvation, by thirst, by disease, though it can take months or years, depending on the store of supplies in the city. In the meantime, the surrounding army bombards the city or maybe tries to dig a tunnel under the wall. And in ancient times, they would slowly build an enormous earthen ramp to eventually be able to move their armies over the wall. The siege of Jerusalem lasted 18 or 30 months, depending on how you read it. Either way, horrible, horrible, just to think about it, let alone to live it. The book of Lamentations, which is also attributed to Jeremiah, describes the siege of Jerusalem in some detail. Starving children begging in the streets, the rich lying on ash heaps, even princes shriveled by hunger, going about unrecognizable. Some resorted to cannibalism, and even worse, which I won't describe here for you. It was generally thought much better to die by the sword than to die slowly by starvation or by disease as it swept through the city. So now picture this scenario, and picture Jeremiah sitting in jail. Don't you think a prisoner would be the last in line to get food or water or medical attention, especially toward the end of a siege, when the siege ramp is nearly finished and is right at the gate? But all is not lost. God comes to Jeremiah and speaks to him. How wonderful must this have been for Jeremiah? And what does God have to say? Your cousin wants to sell you a plot of family land in your hometown. It's rightfully yours to buy. Do this. Really? Really? Do we think that this is what Jeremiah needed to hear at this point? It really could make a good comedy bit in the hands of somebody more talented than me. You want me, I imagine Jeremiah thinking, a starving prisoner, to buy a piece of land in a country about to be conquered. What could possibly be wrong with this idea? Well, just as God had said, the cousin shows up, offers Jeremiah the land. Jeremiah buys it on God's say-so. Very deliberately he buys it. Did you hear how deliberately? He weighs out the money, signs the deed, makes a copy, seals one of them, keeps the open copy too, gets witnesses, gets more witnesses, gives the original to a trusted confidant to put in a sealed clay jar to be buried and saved so that it will last a very, very long time, much like the Dead Sea Scrolls in their clay jars. Why all of this? Because God has promised that one day houses and fields and vineyards will again be bought in the land. Now, God has instructed Jeremiah to buy odd things before. One time, it was an artistic clay jar that he then broke in front of a gathering in Jerusalem to show that God was going to break the Judahites. And this one is really weird, but prophets do get weird from time to time. He was told to buy a loincloth, wear it, then put it under a rock and leave it for a while until it got really rotten, pull it out, wear it again, to describe how the people of Jerusalem were rotting. Both of these to dramatically symbolize the coming destruction of Judah. But this field thing, this is different. This is something positive that God has asked Jeremiah to do. What better sign of confidence and promise than quite literally putting your money where your mouth is, to buy real estate in the land just before it all goes kerflooey. And you just know that with all those witnesses, word got out to those who were suffering in Jerusalem and those already captive in Babylon, that this prophet who had been predicting doom was now saying that not all would be lost, that he had just bought land of all things. He must really mean it. There must really be a future for God's people. This is the fourth sermon in a series called Finding Our New Normal. And I think most of us agree that our nation is facing a unique opportunity to build something better, something more equitable, something more life-giving for everyone as we eventually emerge from this worldwide pandemic. We've been following an article written by a church consultant named Susan Beaumont, who tells us that after the initial shock of a crisis, we need to use different tools to move into our future. The old tools of doubling and tripling our efforts, of marching stoically into the future, will not get us into the future for which we yearn. Rather, she says, and this month we have talked about using some different tools. For instance, surrendering into grace, embracing uncertainty, which we are very good at in the United Church of Christ, finding meaning in our circumstances, and today, taking the next good step. Now, Beaumont points out that in so many ways, we cannot make long-term plans right now. But that doesn't mean that we need to wander aimlessly. There is power in taking the next good step. What is that next step? Last week, I left us all with some homework. I asked you to sit or walk quietly for about 15 minutes, or to spend that time in writing and ask yourself 3 questions. What have I left behind in this time that I do not want to pick back up? Do you remember your answer to that? The second, what have I discovered that I don't want to forget? And the third, what is unfolding that I do not want to let go? Perhaps your next step can emerge from the answers to those questions. We can take a clue, too, from Jeremiah, who, despite his circumstances, kept his ears open to listen to God, kept his eyes open to the opportunities around him. Now, confidentially, and this might be a little encouraging, it wasn't as huge a step as I might have made it out to be. 17 shekels was not a whole lot of money, although it had to have been a lot of money to a starving prisoner in the middle of a siege, come to think of it. Nor was buying that land an obvious, perfect step. That was probably obvious at the time. I cannot imagine that Jeremiah ever lived on that land, nor do we have any record that it was available when his descendants returned from Babylon. But the doing of it, the buying of it, gave concrete hope to those who needed hope. And it has had an outsized influence over the ages. I've made a couple of buying land in Anathoth moves very consciously in my own life. The point is to listen to our lives, to listen to God, to keep our eyes open to the world around us, and to take that next good step, whether it's a perfect step or not, and then another, and then another. Now, the hard part about writing this sermon is that I got to it and thought, I should probably have some good steps outlined for the church, and I don't. I have no idea what the next good step is for the church. It's clear to me what the next good step is not, and that's something. It was very clear that this is a terrible time to take a sabbatical, and 2021, I hope, will be just fine. And, much more importantly, it seems exceedingly unwise to rush the process of returning to worship in the sanctuary. We have excellent guidance from the National Church and from our conference. We will very closely monitor the coronavirus statistics, taking seriously our own vulnerabilities, meticulously researching the safety of group singing. And we will continue to celebrate that we can be church. We are the church, whether we meet in the building or whether we meet beyond the building. Apart from that, I think our work comes from Matthew 28, to continue being and making disciples, to continue to grow in faithfulness together. Most immediately, that work is to figure out who is still on the journey with us. It's hard to know who is with us in worship on Sundays, who is unable to join us on this Facebook Live feed, or who is just turned off by worshiping online. To that end, we are launching a calling campaign over the next 2 weeks to be in touch with every congregant. So be prepared for a random phone call asking how you're doing with all the technology, and more importantly, asking how you are. And after worship on June 7th, I'll be holding a Zoom conversation with people who are interested in learning more about the church, maybe even interested in joining the church. Beyond that, I do not know about our next good step, but I am very hopeful. I am hopeful that by being faithful disciples together with others, we will help our nation find a way to a much-needed new normal, a better normal, a more just and livable normal, because of this experience and all that it has revealed to us. I am hopeful that this will be good and life-giving for the church as well. I'm hopeful because I know that God is in it, and I know that God walks with us. As God said to Jeremiah, and if you keep reading after where we stopped, as Jeremiah repeated in his fervent prayer after buying that field in a devastated land, is anything too hard for God? Scratch that. The Hebrew word is not best translated hard. It's best translated as fantastic. Is anything too fantastic for God? It's what God said to Sarah when she laughed at the idea that she would bear a child at age 90, and if you can't laugh at that, what can you laugh at? Is anything too fantastic for God? It's what God said to Ezekiel when Ezekiel had that dream of the valley of dry and desiccated bones. Could they live again? Is anything too fantastic for God? And it came from the lips of an angelic messenger who visited a young Palestinian peasant girl named Mary with news of the future birth of the Messiah. Is anything too fantastic for God? And so we listen to our lives, we listen to God, we look at the world around us, and we do not despair. The new normal can be, the new normal will be a better and more livable and more just and more loving normal for all people, as together we take one next good step, not necessarily a perfect step, but a good step, together in trust, in confidence, in love. Amen. Amen.